It did not arrive with a birthday card. It did not come with a handwritten apology or a request for forgiveness. It arrived in a stiff, sterile courier envelope that smelled of high-end office toner and old money. I sat at my drafting table, the smell of graphite and espresso filling the air of my firm, and I slit the seal with an X-Acto knife. Inside, there was a single cashier's check. I stared at the numbers. $500,000. Clipped to the check was a note typed on heavy cream linen paper with the letterhead of the committee to elect Judge Robert Vance. The message was brief, it was transactional, it was exactly what I should have expected after 20 years of silence. For your silence, and for the loan of your son for the campaign launch. Do not be late. My father, the Honorable Judge Robert Vance, wasn't trying to reconnect. He was trying to lease a prop. He wanted to rent the grandson he had never met, the grandson he had erased from his life 2 decades ago, just to secure the family values, vote for his Supreme Court bid. $500,000. That was the market price for my dignity. That was the appraisal value of my son's existence. Before we see how this blows up in their faces, drop a comment. What time is it where you are right now? And what's the most audacious thing a toxic family member has ever asked you for? Let me know below. I didn't flinch. I didn't throw the heavy crystal paperweight across the room. Tears are a biological response to shock, and I wasn't shocked. I was an architect. I understood how structures work. I knew exactly how the foundation of the Vance family was built. It was constructed on image, leveraged with debt, and maintained by the quiet removal of any element that didn't fit the blueprint. 20 years ago, that structural defect had been me. Today, they thought they could just pay a renovation fee and patch over the crack. I picked up the invitation included in the envelope. Heavy cardstock, gold foil embossing, the Sterling Atrium. Saturday, November 14th, 7 p.m. The Sterling Atrium. A cold, sharp smile cut across my face. It was the kind of satisfaction you get when the structural load calculations finally prove the engineer right, correcting a decade of errors in a single equation. My parents, in their arrogance, had booked the most prestigious, exclusive event space in Boston for their campaign launch. They wanted the 30-foot glass ceilings, the imported Italian marble, the historic significance. They wanted to project power. They wanted to show the voters that the Vance legacy was as solid as the limestone pillars holding up the roof. But here is the thing about my parents. They never looked at the fine print. They never checked the foundations. They were decorators, not builders. If they had done their due diligence, they would have noticed that the Sterling Atrium was managed by a commercial real estate firm, which was in turn owned by a holding company called Vance Holdings. They saw the name Vance on the contract and assumed it referred to my father's family name. They assumed it was a nod to their old money status in Boston. They probably thought the venue gave them a discount out of respect for the judge. They had no idea that Vance Holdings was the parent company of my architectural firm. They didn't know that the daughter they kicked out into a blizzard 20 years ago, the daughter they erased from the family Bible, was now the landlord of the building where they planned to launch their campaign. This wasn't a family reunion anymore. It was a business transaction. And they were tenants who had just violated the lease. I didn't call them screaming. I didn't tear up the check. Most daughters would have demanded an explanation, but I just reached for the sleek black phone on my desk and dialed my executive assistant. Jessica? Elena answered on the first ring. Everything okay? We need to make an adjustment to the rental contract for the event on Saturday, I said, my voice calm, factual, lethal. The Sterling Atrium event. The Judge Vance campaign. Okay, Elena said, the sound of typing clicking in the background. What do they need? Catering changes? Security detail? No, I said, leaning back in my chair, looking at the $500,000 check that sat on top of my blueprints. I want you to upgrade the audiovisual package. Override the standard setup. I want the highest fidelity sound system we have. Install the concert grade speakers. Concert grade for a political speech? Yes, I said. I want to make sure that when someone speaks into that microphone, every single person in the room and every person watching the live stream hears every syllable with crystal clarity. No static, no interference, just the truth. Done, she said. Anything else? Yes. Mark my RSVP as attending. I paused, looking at the photo of my daughter on my desk, and add a +1. I hung up. I looked at the check again. They thought they were buying my silence. They had no idea they were funding their own demolition. This wasn't revenge, it was a structural inspection, and I was about to condemn the building. In architecture, we study the point of failure. It is rarely the storm that destroys a building. It is the hidden defect in the design that makes it unable to withstand the wind. My point of failure occurred on November 14th, 2004. It wasn't just raining, it was a blizzard that buried Boston in 2 feet of snow. I was 18 years old, standing in the marble foyer of my parents' Beacon Hill brownstone, holding a positive pregnancy test. My father didn't shout. Shouting implies a loss of control, and Judge Robert Vance never lost control. He simply looked at me over the rim of his reading glasses, adjusted his silk tie, and delivered the verdict. "You are a structural weakness, Jessica," he said, his voice as level as a foundation slab. "We are building a legacy here, and this family cannot afford liabilities." He opened the heavy oak door. The wind howled outside, freezing the air in the hallway instantly. "Fix the error, or leave," he said. "If you walk out that door with that child, you are dead to us. Your trust fund is revoked. Your name is removed from the will. You cease to exist." I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I walked out. Caleb was waiting for me at the bottom of the steps in his rusted pickup truck. He wasn't a suitable match by Vance standards. He was a carpenter. He had calloused hands, sawdust in his hair, and the kind of integrity my father could only pretend to have during election cycles. We spent the next 5 years living in a basement apartment in South Boston that smelled of damp concrete and cheap heating oil. We didn't have money, but we had structure. Caleb built furniture. I designed renovations for neighbors who paid in cash. We were poor, but we were solid. Then came the second structural failure, but this one wasn't mine. Caleb was working on a high-rise downtown. The developers were behind schedule. They were losing money every day the site sat idle. So they made a calculation. They decided that bracing the trench properly would take 2 days they didn't have. They gambled on the soil stability. They lost. The trench collapsed on a Tuesday morning. Caleb was inside. Gravity is honest. It doesn't care about your intentions, your love, or your future. It only cares about physics. The developers settled out of court to avoid a public inquiry. They sent me a check for $8,500. That was the value they placed on the father of my child. That was the cost of cutting corners. I stood at his grave with my 4-year-old daughter, holding that check, and I made a vow. I would never be powerless again. I would never let anyone I loved live in a structure, physical or familial, that wasn't sound. I took that $8,500 and I went to night school. I finished my degree. I worked 20-hour days. I didn't just learn to draw buildings. I learned to engineer them so they would never fall. I built my firm, Vance & Associates, on a single principle. Integrity is not optional. My parents built their lives on appearances. I built mine on steel and concrete. They spent 20 years polishing their facade, while I spent 20 years owning the city block they stood on. And now, they wanted to invite me back inside. They didn't realize that I wasn't the teenager they kicked out anymore. I was the demolition expert. The meeting took place on Wednesday afternoon in the VIP suite of the Sterling Atrium. I arrived 5 minutes early. I walked through the main hall, noting that the AV team was already installing the concert-grade speakers I had ordered. My employees nodded to me. As I passed, their faces professional, giving away nothing. They knew who I was. To them, I was the owner, the signing authority, the architect who signed their paychecks. To the 2 people waiting in the VIP suite, I was just a loose end that needed to be tied up. My parents, Robert and Sarah Vance, were standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the Boston skyline. They looked exactly as I remember them, polished, expensive, and completely hollow. "You're late," my mother said, not turning around. "I'm early," I corrected. "But let's not argue about timelines. You paid for a service. Tell me what you need." My father turned. He had aged. The lines around his eyes were deeper, but his posture was still rigid with authority. He didn't offer a hug. He didn't offer a handshake. He gestured to the leather chair opposite him as if I were a junior associate being called in for a performance review. "We need the boy," he said. "The boy?" I asked, keeping my face blank. "Your son," my mother clarified, finally turning. She held up a tablet. On the screen was a blurry photo from a Forbes 30 Under 30 article titled "The Next Generation of Innovators." I recognized the photo immediately. It was my daughter, Haley. She was wearing a tailored suit, her hair cut short in a sharp, modern style. She looked fierce. She looked androgynous. And to my parents, who saw only what they wanted to see, she looked like a grandson. "Jay Vance," my father said, tapping the screen. That's what the caption says. Jay Vance. We assumed it stands for Jay. "We've been testing the demographics," my mother added, her voice clinical. "The voters respond well to a male heir. A tech entrepreneur, it balances your father's traditional judicial record with modern innovation. We've already mentioned him in 3 press releases." I stared at them. The absurdity was almost suffocating. They had invented a person based on a typo and a haircut. They had built an entire campaign strategy around a grandson who didn't exist. "You want me to bring Jay to the stage?" I said slowly. "We want you to bring him, stand there, smile, and let him say a few words about family values," my father said. "Then you leave. That is what the 500,000 is for. And if I refuse..." The room went quiet. The air conditioning hummed, a low, artificial sound. My father took a step closer. For the first time, the mask of civility slipped, revealing the ruthlessness underneath. "Don't be stupid, Jessica. We know about your little business. Vance and Associates, renovations, historic restorations." He said the words with a sneer, as if preserving history was somehow beneath him. "If you embarrass us on Saturday, if you ruin this launch, I will make one phone call to the zoning board. I will have every permit you hold revoked. I will bury your company in so much red tape you won't be able to build a doghouse in this city." I looked at him. I looked at my mother, who was nodding in agreement, her face a mask of cold calculation. They were standing in my building. They were breathing my air conditioning. They were threatening to destroy my company while renting a venue owned by my holding corporation. The irony was structural perfection. "I understand," I said. I stood up. I didn't defend myself. I didn't correct them about Haley's gender. I didn't tell them that J stood for justice, not J. "I'll bring the child," I said, "and we'll be there, center stage." "Good," my father said, turning back to the window, dismissing me. "Make sure he wears a tie. Blue. It tests better with the suburban demographic." I walked out of the suite. As the door clicked shut behind me, I checked the time. The demolition was scheduled for Saturday. I just needed to make sure the explosives were wired correctly. I didn't make it to the elevator before I was intercepted. "Jessica." The voice was familiar, but it lacked the command of my father's or the cold sharpness of my mother's. It was weary. I turned to see my brother, Justin. Justin was the golden child, the plan A. While I was being kicked out into the snow at 18, Justin was being groomed for medical school, for country club memberships, for the perfect marriage, and the perfect life. He was 40 now, a successful orthopedic surgeon, wearing a suit that probably cost more than my first car. But up close, the cracks in the facade were visible. He looked exhausted. His eyes were red-rimmed, and there was a tremor in his hand as he adjusted his cufflinks. He didn't look like a winner. He looked like a man holding up a collapsing ceiling with his bare hands. "I saw them," he said, his voice low, glancing toward the VIP suite. They're manic. They have everything riding on Saturday, Jess. Everything. I know, I said calmly. They invested heavily in the wrong asset. It's not just the election, Justin whispered, stepping closer, smelling of nervous sweat and expensive scotch. It's the finances. They're leveraged to the hilt. If Dad doesn't get the seat, if the donors pull out, the house of cards falls. He looked at me, pleading, just, please, don't make a scene. Just give them the photo op. I can't handle another crisis. I can't. I looked at my brother. For years, I had resented him. I had hated him for staying warm while I froze. I had hated him for his silence when they disowned me. But standing there in the hallway of the building I owned, looking at the man who ostensibly had everything, my resentment evaporated. It was replaced by something colder, but kinder. Pity. I realized then that there are two ways to destroy a child. You can throw them away, or you can keep them. My parents had thrown me into the wild. It was cruel. Yes, it was terrifying. But the wild had taught me how to hunt. It had taught me how to build shelter. It had forced me to become strong, independent, and unbreakable. Justin? They had kept him. They had built a beautiful, gilded cage around him. They fed him, groomed him, and told him exactly who to be, what to say, and how to breathe. I was the wolf who had to survive the winter. He was the prize poodle who had never felt the rain. I was thrown into the wild, but he was the one trapped in the zoo. And looking at him now, terrified of his own handlers, I knew the truth. I was the only one in this family who was actually free. I'm not going to make a scene, Justin, I said, my voice soft. I'm going to tell the truth. There's a difference. With them, there isn't, he said bitterly. Go home to your kids, Justin. Stay off the stage on Saturday. I left him standing there, a prisoner in a suit, and took the elevator down to the loading dock. Haley was waiting for me in my car. My daughter, the grandson they were expecting, was scrolling through her phone. She looked up as I slid into the driver's seat. She had her hair cropped short, her jawline sharp, her eyes intelligent and calculating. She was wearing a navy blue blazer over a crisp white shirt. How did it go? She asked. They took the bait, I said. They want Jay to wear a blue tie. It tests well with the suburban demographic. Haley snorted, a sound of pure teenage derision. She reached into the back seat and pulled out a garment bag. I bought a blue tie and a suit that fits better than anything they could rent. Are you sure you want to do this? I asked. Once we walk out on that stage, we can't walk it back. Haley looked at the building towering above us, my building. Then she looked at me. Mom, she said, they made you homeless for being pregnant with me. They tried to erase us. I don't just want to do this. I want to look them in the eye when the check bounces. I started the engine. Then let's go get you a tie. The structural inspection was complete. The demolition charges were set. Now we just had to wait for the grand opening. The difference between a mistake and a crime is often just a matter of paperwork. And my parents, for all their expensive lawyers and political consultants, had just made a clerical error that would carry a prison sentence. It was 4 hours before the doors of the Sterling Atrium were set to open. I was in my office reviewing the structural schematics for the event one last time when my phone rang. It was Marcus, my forensic accountant. Marcus was a man who viewed numbers with the same cold, religious reverence that I held for steel beams. He didn't do small talk. I traced the routing number on the cashier's check, he said. It's not a personal withdrawal, Marcus said, his voice flat. The funds didn't come from Robert or Sarah Vance's private accounts. They came from the committee to elect Judge Vance, specifically the Discretionary Outreach Fund. I stopped breathing for a second. The silence in my office was absolute. Are you sure? I asked. 100%, Marcus replied. They listed the withdrawal as consulting fees, but the check is made out to you. Unless you're a registered political consultant, Jessica, this is misappropriation of campaign funds. It's wire fraud. It's a federal felony. I hung up the phone and looked at the check sitting on my desk. $500,000? They were so arrogant, so accustomed to using other people's resources to build their lives, that they hadn't even used their own money to bribe me. They had used their donors' money. They had used the very funds given to them to uphold the law to commit a crime against their own daughter. In that moment, the check ceased to be a bribe. It became a weapon. If I cashed it, I was an accomplice. But if I displayed it, I was a whistleblower. I didn't deposit the check. Instead, I called my assistant. "Get me a frame," I said. "Black wood, museum-grade glass, matte border, and bring it here immediately." I spent the next hour carefully mounting the evidence. I treated it like a piece of high art. When I was finished, I wrapped the framed check in brown paper and tucked it under my arm. Haley walked in a moment later. She was wearing the suit we had bought, charcoal gray, sharp, tailored to perfection. The blue tie was knotted tightly at her throat. She didn't look like a boy. She looked like power. "You ready?" she asked. "I am," I said. "Grab the package." We arrived at the Sterling Atrium at 6:30. The air inside was perfumed with expensive lilies and even more expensive ambition. 500 of Boston's elite were milling around, clutching champagne flutes, waiting to donate to the man who promised to restore moral order to the state. My parents were working the room. I watched them from the mezzanine. My father was shaking hands, projecting that warm, fatherly authority that had won him 3 terms on the bench. My mother was laughing, her hand resting possessively on the arm of a senator's wife. They looked invincible. They looked like they owned the world. They didn't see me until I was standing 10 feet away. My father's eyes flicked to Haley, to the blue tie, the short hair, and a look of profound relief washed over him. He didn't see a granddaughter. He saw a demographic. He saw a prop. "You made it," he whispered, stepping close to me, his voice low so the donors wouldn't hear. "And you brought the boy. Good. Keep him quiet until I call him up." "We'll be right here," I said. The lights dimmed. The concert-grade speakers I had installed hummed to life. The spotlight hit the podium. My father walked onto the stage to thunderous applause. He adjusted the microphone. The microphone I had ensured would capture every nuance of his voice. "Friends," he began, his voice booming through the hall with crystal clarity. "We live in a time where values are crumbling, but I believe in the foundation. I believe in the family." I stood in the wings, holding the framed check. I watched him build his tower of lies, brick by brick. "And tonight," he said, beaming at the crowd, "I want to share my legacy with you. I want to introduce you to the future of the Vance name. My grandson, Jay." He extended his hand toward the wings. I looked at Haley. She buttoned her jacket. I picked up the frame. The trap was sprung. It was time for the demolition. I walked onto the stage. The applause was deafening, amplified by the acoustics I had personally calibrated. My father stood at the podium, a smile plastered on his face that didn't reach his eyes. He placed a heavy hand on Haley's shoulder, guiding her toward the microphone like a show pony. "And here he is," my father boomed. "The young man who represents our future, Jay Vance." He stepped back, expecting Haley to read the teleprompter, to recite the 3 minutes of drivel about family values they had scripted. Haley didn't look at the teleprompter. She looked at me. I nodded. I stepped forward and took the microphone from the stand. My father's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but he recovered quickly, assuming I was playing my part as a dutiful, repentant daughter. I scanned the 500 donors. Then I locked eyes with the lens of the live stream camera. In architecture, I began, my voice ringing out with absolute clarity. We talk about something called structural fatigue. It is a phenomenon where a building looks solid on the outside, the paint is fresh, the marble is polished, but inside, the load-bearing beams are rotting. And the terrifying thing about structural fatigue is that the collapse doesn't happen slowly. It happens all at once. The room went quiet. This wasn't the speech on the teleprompter. My father is running on a platform of family values, I continued. He talks about the solid foundation of the Vance legacy, but a foundation cannot hold if it is built on a lie. My father took a step toward me. Jessica, he hissed, his voice low. Stick to the script. I ignored him. I gestured to Haley. This is not Jay, I said. This is Haley. She is not a tech entrepreneur. She is a pre-law student. She is my daughter. And she is the granddaughter my parents erased from their lives 20 years ago because she was born out of wedlock to a carpenter they deemed unsuitable. A murmur rippled through the crowd. My mother's face had gone pale, her perfect makeup standing out like a mask against her skin. I reached down and picked up the black frame I had set against the podium. I held it up to the light. The concert-grade lighting illuminated the check perfectly. And this, I said, is a cashier's check for $500,000. My father sent it to me 3 days ago. It was the price he put on my integrity. He paid me $500,000 to lie to you tonight, to pretend that we are a happy, united family. I turned the frame so the camera could see the details. But here is the structural defect, I said. This money didn't come from his pocket. It came from the committee to elect Judge Vance. This is your money, your donations. Used to bribe a witness. The room erupted. Flashbulbs exploded. My father lunged for the microphone. Cut the feed, he screamed, his composure shattering completely. Security, remove her. Remove her from this stage immediately. 2 security guards in dark suits started up the stairs. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I just looked at my father with the cold, hard pity of an engineer watching a bridge fall. I wouldn't do that. I said, my voice calm but amplified, so it thundered over the chaos. You have no right, my father shouted, his face purple. Get out of my venue! Your venue? I asked. I pulled a folded document from my blazer pocket. I didn't need to read it. I knew every line. Check the lease agreement, Robert. The Sterling Atrium is owned by Vance Holdings, and Vance Holdings is a wholly owned subsidiary of my firm. I looked at the security guards who had paused halfway up the stairs. I am the landlord, I said. And as of this moment, the tenant is in violation of the code of conduct. You are trespassing. I turned back to my father. He looked small. He looked like a man who had just realized the roof was coming down on his head. The event is over, I said. Please vacate the premises. I took Haley's hand and we walked off the stage. We didn't run. We walked with the steady, measured pace of people who have nothing to hide. Behind us, the Vance campaign didn't just end. It collapsed. The fallout was swift. By Monday, my father had withdrawn from the race, facing a federal investigation for campaign finance fraud. The Vance reputation, built over 40 years, dissolved in 48 hours. But I didn't watch the news. I was busy building something new. Thanksgiving that year was different. We didn't have crystal glasses or catered food. We were at my farmhouse, sitting around a table. I had restored myself. Haley was there. Mrs. Torres, my first client, was there, and Justin was there with his 2 kids, finally out of the cage, learning how to breathe without a handler. As I looked around the table, listening to the laughter that filled the room, real laughter, not polite social noise, I realized something profound. Biology is just a blueprint. It is a suggestion, a starting point. But love, loyalty, showing up when the walls are shaking, that is the mortar. You can tear up the blueprint, but you cannot build a home without the mortar. I looked at Haley, who was teaching her cousins how to carve the turkey. I looked at the life I had built from the wreckage of my past. It wasn't perfect. It had cracks, but it was mine. And it was solid. My parents tried to buy a legacy. I chose to build one, and in the end, that made all the difference. If you believe that family is what you build, not just what you're born into, hit that subscribe button. Share this story with the architect of your own happiness. Thanks for watching.